October 15th, 1974. Steve McQueen had just wrapped his final scene on Thunder Road when Vincent Torino walked up to him, cocaine-confident and 20 years younger. "Face it, Steve," Vinny said loud enough for the whole crew to hear. "You're just my shadow now." McQueen stared at him for 10 seconds, said nothing, then walked to his motorcycle and rode into the desert. 6 hours later, a stunt car flipped during night shooting. Danny Reeves, 22 years old, died on impact. The police found Vinny's flask in the wreckage, but when they came looking, McQueen stepped forward instead. "It was my fault," he said. "I was driving." Hollywood buried the truth that night. McQueen's career never recovered. Vinny became a star. But secrets in Hollywood don't stay buried forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came at 3:47 a.m., 40 years to the minute after Steve McQueen flatlined. Frank Morrison's weathered hands trembled as he reached for the rotary phone beside his narrow trailer bed, bourbon still heavy on his tongue from another sleepless night. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice that cut through the static was crystal clear. "Frank Morrison? This is Dylan Cross. I think we need to talk about November 7th, 1980. The phone nearly slipped from Frank's grip. Outside his Malibu trailer, the Pacific crashed against the rocks with the same relentless rhythm that had soundtracked 4 decades of his exile. Movie posters from Bullitt, The Great Escape. Andelman stared down at him from wood-paneled walls, their edges curled and faded like his memories should have been. "Who the hell is this?" Frank's voice came out as gravel. "I'm an actor. Well, I'm going to be the biggest actor in Hollywood once people see what I found in the Paramount archives. Studio footage from 1968. Some very interesting conversations between you and Steve McQueen about who really drove that Mustang down those San Francisco streets." Frank's blood turned to ice water. The leather jacket hanging on his bedroom door, McQueen's jacket, the one he'd worn that final night in the hospital, seemed to mock him in the moonlight streaming through dirty windows. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid." "Oh, but I do." Dylan's voice carried the kind of arrogant confidence that only came from youth and ambition. "See, I've been researching my new role, playing a stunt double in a period piece about Hollywood's golden age. Funny thing about research, sometimes you find more than you're looking for." Frank stood on unsteady legs, his 68-year-old body protesting every movement. The trailer creaked around him like an old ship in a storm. Through the small window, he could see the lights of Malibu stretching down the coast, each one representing dreams that had either come true or died trying. "The footage shows you and McQueen switching jackets before the chase scenes," Dylan continued. "Shows you getting behind the wheel while he watched from the sidewalk. Shows him calling you the real king of cool when he thought the cameras weren't rolling. McQueen did his own stunts. The lie tasted like copper pennies on Frank's tongue. He'd been telling it for so long it had almost become truth, not according to what I found, and definitely not according to what he says on that hospital recording." Frank's knees buckled. He gripped the edge of his small kitchen table, knocking over an empty bourbon bottle that rolled across the linoleum with a hollow sound. "What recording?" "The one where he's talking about Bullitt, about how the world needed to know the truth about who really made that chase scene legendary, about how his legacy was built on someone else's courage." Dylan paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "Your courage, Frank." The trailer spun around Frank as 40 years of carefully constructed silence crumbled. He could still feel McQueen's fingers gripping his wrist in that sterile hospital room, could still hear the desperation in his friend's voice. "Tell them the truth." But Frank had chosen loyalty over truth, protection over revelation. "What do you want?" Frank whispered. "I want what every actor wants, to be remembered. And this story, your story, it's going to make me unforgettable." Dylan's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "See, I've already pitched it to 3 major studios as a documentary. The man behind McQueen, how Hollywood's greatest lie became its greatest legend." Frank sank into his threadbare recliner, the same chair where he'd spent countless nights staring at those posters, drowning in bourbon and what-ifs. The walls of his trailer seemed to close in around him, lined with the ghosts of stunts he'd performed, jumps he'd taken, crashes he'd survived, all while wearing another man's face for the cameras. You want money? Is that what this is? Money? Dylan laughed again. Frank, you're thinking too small. This isn't about money. This is about truth. About giving credit where credit is due. About showing the world that their hero was just a pretty face in front of a camera while the real man, the real rebel, lived in the shadows. Through the phone, Frank could hear the sound of papers shuffling, the click of computer keys. This wasn't just a threat, it was a countdown. I'm giving you 48 hours, Dylan said. Either you help me tell this story the right way, with your cooperation, or I tell it my way. With or without you, Frank Morrison, the world is going to learn that Steve McQueen's legend died with him. And maybe it should have. The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone in his hand, then at the movie posters surrounding him like accusers. Somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine roared to life, the same sound that had defined both their lives. What did it mean to protect a legend when the legend itself had wanted to confess? What did loyalty look like when your dying friend had asked for truth? And what happened to shadows when someone finally turned on the lights? Frank Morrison was about to find out. The phone slipped from Frank's fingers and clattered against the linoleum floor, the dial tone droning like a death knell. He stared at it for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths that tasted of bourbon and 40 years of buried secrets. Outside, the Pacific continued its eternal assault on the rocks below. But the sound that had once comforted him now felt like an accusation. Frank Morrison, 68 years old, keeper of ghosts. He'd been 28 when he first met Steve McQueen on the set Obelette, young enough to believe that loyalty was simple, that friendship was about taking bullets, or in his case taking crashes, taking leaps, taking the wheel when the cameras rolled, and death waited around every corner. He'd been McQueen's shadow for 12 years, invisible and indispensable, the man who made legends possible while never becoming one himself. The trailer around him told the story of a life lived in margins, 40 feet of aluminum and regret, parked on a cliff overlooking the Pacific where the sound of engines couldn't follow him. The movie posters weren't decorations. They were evidence. Bullet, where he'd driven that green Mustang through San Francisco's hills while McQueen signed autographs. The Great Escape, where he'd taken the motorcycle over barbed wire while McQueen charmed the press. Le Mans, where he'd risked everything in a Porsche 917 while McQueen posed with the trophies. But there were other photographs too, tucked in the spaces between the posters, Polaroids that never made it to the magazines. Steve laughing at something Frank had said between takes, the two of them sharing a beer after a particularly dangerous sequence, both wearing identical grins and identical bruises. Steve's arm around Frank's shoulder at rap parties where Frank was always the only non-famous face in the room. In the corner, draped over a kitchen chair like a sleeping cat, sat McQueen's brown leather jacket, the one he'd been wearing that final night in Cedars-Sinai, when the cancer had eaten away everything except his need to confess. Frank reached for it now, his fingers tracing the worn spots where McQueen's elbows had rubbed against motorcycle handlebars and steering wheels he'd never actually gripped when the cameras were rolling. The jacket still smelled faintly of cigarettes and expensive cologne, though that might have been Frank's imagination clinging to details that should have faded decades ago. He pulled it on. It fit him perfectly as it always had, and immediately felt the weight of what Dylan Cross was threatening to destroy. This wasn't just about movie history or Hollywood lies. This was about the promise Frank had made to a dying man who'd grabbed his wrist with fingers like paper and whispered, "Tell them I wasn't afraid. Tell them I was brave." But Steve had also said something else that night, something that had haunted Frank through 4 decades of silence. Tell them the truth about who made me look fearless. Frank had chosen the first request and ignored the second. He walked to the trailer's single window and looked out at the lights of Malibu stretching along the coast. Somewhere out there, Dylan Cross was probably celebrating, confident that he'd found his ticket to stardom in the ruins of Frank's carefully guarded past. The kid didn't understand what he was threatening to demolish, not just McQueen's legend, but the last connection Frank had to the only family he'd ever known. There had been others, of course, Other stunt doubles, other drivers, other invisible men who'd risked their lives for someone else's glory. But Frank and Steve had been different. They'd been friends, real friends, in an industry where friendship was usually just another word for networking. Steve had trusted him with more than dangerous stunts. He'd trusted him with his fears, his insecurities, his terror that he wasn't brave enough to deserve the image the cameras created. "You make me look like a hero," Steve had told him once, after Frank had walked away from a car crash that should have killed him. "But you're the one who's actually fearless." Frank had laughed it off then, the way he always did. But now, standing in his exile with Dylan's ultimatum echoing in his ears, he wondered if that had been Steve's first attempt at the confession that would eventually consume his final hours. The bourbon bottle on the kitchen table called to him, but Frank ignored it. For the first time in years, he needed clarity more than comfort. Dylan Cross had given him 48 hours, but Frank knew the countdown had really started 40 years ago, in a hospital room where he'd made a promise that was about to destroy everything he'd spent his life protecting. Outside, another motorcycle engine growled to life somewhere in the distance. Frank closed his eyes and remembered the feeling of acceleration, the rush of speed, the moment when fear transformed into something that looked like courage from the outside. He'd been living on borrowed time ever since Steve died. Maybe it was finally time to pay the debt. Frank stood at the window for what felt like hours, watching the lights of Malibu blur and sharpen as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The borrowed time he'd spoken of felt suddenly finite, each second ticking away like sand through an hourglass he could no longer ignore. He was about to turn away from the window when headlights swept across his gravel driveway. The engine that cut through the night air wasn't the distant motorcycle he'd been hearing. This was closer, immediate, and familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. A black sedan crunched to a stop outside his trailer, its headlights casting long shadows across the weathered aluminum siding. Frank's hand instinctively went to the leather jacket he still wore, McQueen's jacket, as if it might offer protection against whatever was coming. The car door slammed with the finality of a coffin lid. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate, and Frank found himself holding his breath. Through the thin walls of his trailer, he could hear someone climbing the 3 rickety steps to his door. The knock, when it came, was soft but insistent. "Frank? I know you're in there." The voice hit him like a physical blow, female, weathered by time but unmistakably familiar. He hadn't heard it in over 15 years, but he would have recognized it anywhere. His legs moved without conscious thought, carrying him to the door that suddenly felt like the threshold between past and present. "Nail?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Open the door, Frank." He fumbled with the chain lock, his hands trembling worse than they had when Dylan's call first woke him. The door swung open to reveal Nile Adams, Neil McQueen, as she'd been known during her marriage to Steve. She stood in the spill of his porch light, looking older but still elegant, her silver hair catching the glow like moonlight on water. She wore a simple black coat and carried a leather satchel that seemed to weigh more than it should. "Hello, Frank." Her eyes held the same sadness they'd carried at Steve's funeral. But there was something else there now. A resignation that spoke of decisions already made. "May I come in?" Frank stepped aside, unable to find his voice. She entered his small sanctuary with the grace of someone who'd once commanded Hollywood soundstages, though her presence made the trailer feel even more cramped and shabby than usual. Her gaze swept over the movie posters, the bourbon bottles, the accumulated debris of his exile, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "You're wearing his jacket," she said softly. Frank looked down at the brown leather as if he'd forgotten he had it on. Dylan Cross called tonight. I know about the call." Neil set her satchel on his kitchen table with a soft thud. "Dylan reached out to me 3 days ago. Wanted me to verify some details about Steve's final weeks." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "He played me portions of the recording." The words hit Frank like a sledgehammer. If Neil had heard the hospital recording, she knew everything, not just about the stunts, but about Steve's final confession, the secret that Frank had carried alone for 40 years. The secret that went far deeper than who drove which car or performed which stunt. "Nail, I can explain." "Can you?" She turned to face him, and her composure cracked just enough to reveal the pain underneath. "Can you explain why you let me spend 40 years believing my husband died, thinking he was a fraud? Can you explain why you kept his confession to yourself when you knew how much he wanted to tell the truth?" Frank felt the walls of his trailer pressing in around him. This was worse than Dylan's threats, worse than any exposure the young actor could orchestrate. This was judgment from the one person whose opinion had mattered to Steve almost as much as his own legacy. "He asked me to protect him," Frank said, the words tumbling out like a dam break. His last words weren't about confessing. They were about making sure the world still believed in Steve McQueen. He said the truth would destroy everything he'd built. "No." Frank Nail's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. His last words were about you, about how you deserved credit for making him look fearless when he felt like a coward inside. She opened the satchel and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "I found this in his things after he died. I never opened it because it had your name on it, and you disappeared before I could give it to you." Frank stared at the envelope as if it might bite him. His name was written across it in Steve's familiar scrawl for Frank Morrison, the real king of cool. 40 years, Neil whispered. "I've been carrying this for 40 years, waiting for the right moment. Dylan Cross just forced my hand." Frank's fingers shook as he reached for the envelope. Whatever was inside would either vindicate the choice he'd made or destroy the last shred of peace he'd managed to build in his exile. The equilibrium was shattered. There was no going back. Frank's hand froze inches from the envelope, as if proximity alone might trigger an explosion he wasn't ready to survive. The yellowed manila seemed to pulse with 40 years of accumulated weight. Steve's handwriting as familiar as his own heartbeat, but infinitely more dangerous. "I can't." The words escaped him like a prayer. "Niall, I can't open that. Not now." She studied his face with the patience of someone who'd spent decades waiting for this moment. "You think ignorance is still an option? Dylan Cross has the hospital recording, Frank. He has the studio footage. Whatever Steve wrote in this letter, it's going to come out whether you read it or not." Frank backed away from the table, the leather jacket suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. "Maybe we can stop him, buy him off. There has to be something he wants more than... He wants to be famous." Neil's voice carried the bitter wisdom of someone who'd watched ambition devour better men than Dylan Cross. He wants to be the one who exposed Hollywood's greatest lie. "Do you really think money is going to satisfy that hunger?" The trailer felt smaller with each passing second, the movie posters staring down like witnesses to his 40 years of cowardice. Frank's eyes darted from Bullet Toth, the great escaped Toll Man's, each one a monument to choices he'd made in shadows while Steve stood in spotlights he'd never deserved. "We could deny it," Frank said, desperation making his voice crack. "My word against some old footage. Who's going to believe—" "I will." The simple statement cut through his protests like a blade. "I'll verify every word Dylan says, because it's what Steve wanted. It's what he's been trying to tell the world for 40 years through you, and you've been too afraid to listen." Frank pressed his back against the trailer wall, feeling the aluminum flex under his weight. "You don't understand what this will do, to his legacy, to everything people believe about him. He was their rebel, their hero. If they find out he was afraid..." He was afraid. Neil's composure finally cracked, revealing the anger she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest. He was terrified, Frank. Terrified of cars, of speed, of dying on some movie set for the entertainment of people who'd forget his name in 5 years. But he did those movies anyway because he thought that's what the world needed from him. She gestured toward the envelope, its presence dominating the small space like a loaded gun. "That letter? It's not just about the stunts. It's about the night terrors he had before every driving scene. It's about the panic attacks he hid between takes. It's about how the only time he felt truly brave was when he was watching you do what he couldn't." Frank slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, the weight of 4 decades suddenly unbearable. Through the thin walls he could hear the Pacific continuing its eternal assault on the rocks below, indifferent to human secrets and the pain of keeping them. "He made me promise," Frank whispered. "That last night, when the morphine wasn't enough anymore and he knew it was ending. He grabbed my hand and made me swear I'd protect what we'd built together. What you'd built, Niall corrected. Steve knew the difference. Even if you don't. She knelt beside him, her presence both comforting and accusatory. In the harsh fluorescent light of the trailer's kitchen, Frank could see every year that had passed since Steve's funeral. Every day she'd spent carrying secrets that weren't hers to bear. "I've been getting calls," she said quietly. Other people Dylan's contacted, stunt coordinators who remember, crew members who kept quiet out of loyalty, camera operators who saw things they were told to forget. She paused, watching Frank's face crumble with each revelation. "They're scared, Frank, not of the truth coming out, but of being the ones who stayed silent when they could have spoken up for you." Frank's head fell back against the wall with a hollow thud. The network of silence he'd thought protected Steve's legacy was actually a web of complicity that had trapped everyone who'd witnessed the truth. Dylan Cross wasn't just threatening to expose Frank's secret. He was threatening to reveal an entire industry's willingness to sacrifice honesty for mythology. "How long do we have?" Frank asked. "He's releasing the story tomorrow. Some entertainment website that specializes in exposing Hollywood scandals." Neil's voice carried the finality of a countdown that had already reached 0. "I came here tonight to give you a choice. You can read Steve's letter and find out what he really wanted, or you can let Dylan Cross define your story for you." Frank stared at the envelope, then at the woman who'd loved Steve McQueen before the world claimed him as their own. Outside, another motorcycle engine roared to life in the distance, and for a moment, Frank could almost believe it was Steve himself, still running from truths that demanded to be told. The equilibrium wasn't just shattered, it was obliterated, and in the wreckage, Frank Morrison would finally have to choose between the comfortable lie he'd lived and the terrifying possibility of redemption. Frank reached for the envelope with fingers that felt disconnected from his body, as if watching someone else's hand move through water. The paper was softer than he'd expected, worn at the edges from 4 decades of Neil carrying it like a talisman of unfinished business. Steve's handwriting blurred as Frank's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back since 1980. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the words written in Steve's increasingly shaky hand, as the cancer ate away at his strength but not his determination. "Frank, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably drinking yourself to death with guilt. Stop. What happened between us wasn't your fault, and what's about to happen isn't either." Frank's breath caught. The letter wasn't what he'd expected. No confession about cowardice, no plea for protection of his legacy. The next paragraph made his world tilt sideways. "I know you think that last night was about me asking you to keep secrets, but I wasn't asking you to hide the truth about the stunts. I was trying to tell you the truth about November 7th, 1980. The night you were supposed to drive me home from the hospital." The date hit Frank like a physical blow. November 7th, the night before Steve died, when Frank had been scheduled to pick him up for what they'd both known would be their final ride together. But Frank had been nursing a broken wrist from a motorcycle accident 3 days earlier, unable to grip a steering wheel properly. Steve had insisted on driving himself home in his brown Porsche, the same color as the jacket Frank still wore. "You've spent 40 years thinking you failed me because you weren't behind the wheel. But Frank, I crashed that car on purpose." The words swam on the page as Frank's hands began shaking uncontrollably. Neil moved closer, her presence the only thing keeping him anchored to the present moment. The pain was getting worse. The doctors said weeks, maybe a month if I was lucky. But lucky for what? More morphine? More pretending I was still the king of cool when I couldn't even hold down water? I drove that Porsche straight into the guardrail on Mulholland Drive because I wanted to die like Steve McQueen, not waste away like some cancer-eaten shell of who I used to be. Frank's vision blurred completely. He remembered the phone call from the hospital. Steve's condition had suddenly worsened after what they'd called a minor traffic incident, a single car accident, damage mostly to the passenger side. Steve had claimed he'd swerved to avoid a deer. But I fucked it up, Frank. Just like I fucked up every real stunt I ever tried to do. Walked away without a scratch while my passenger side got demolished. Even my own death was something I couldn't do right without you. Jesus Christ, Frank whispered, the letter trembling in his grip. Neil, did you know? Did you know he tried to— Keep reading, she said softly. though her voice carried the weight of someone who discovered this truth years ago and carried it alone. I died 2 days later in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed like some science fiction nightmare. But I need you to understand something. Every brave thing Steve McQueen ever did on screen was really you. Every time I looked fearless, it was because you were taking the real risks while I took the credit. The world thinks Steve McQueen died of cancer, and that's true. But Steve McQueen, the man, died years earlier, somewhere between the first time you doubled for me and the last time I was honest about who I really was. Frank's chest felt crushed, each breath a monumental effort. The guilt he'd carried for 40 years, the weight of not being there when Steve needed him most, was transforming into something far more devastating. Steve hadn't needed protection that night. He'd needed intervention. Dylan Cross is going to expose the stunt work eventually. Some ambitious kid always does. But when that happens, I want the world to know that Frank Morrison wasn't Steve McQueen's shadow. Steve McQueen was Frank Morrison's pale imitation. You were the hero of every movie we made together. I was just the guy who showed up to accept the applause. The final paragraph was written in different ink, as if added later. I never told you this when I had the chance, but you saved my life more times than you know. Not from car crashes or motorcycle wrecks, but from the knowledge that I was living a lie. When I watched you do what I couldn't, I felt proud to be your friend. That's the only legacy worth protecting. Frank let the letter fall to his lap as the full weight of 40 years of misunderstanding crashed over him. He'd spent decades protecting a secret that Steve had wanted exposed, carrying guilt for a death Steve had tried to choose for himself. The man he'd thought he'd failed had actually been the one person who understood exactly who Frank Morrison really was. Outside, the motorcycle engine grew louder, closer, and Frank realized with crystalline clarity that Dylan Cross's ultimatum was no longer the most dangerous thing in his world. The most dangerous thing was the truth Steve had been trying to tell him all along, that some secrets weren't meant to be kept, and some shadows were bigger than the men who cast them. Frank stared at the letter in his lap, the words blurring as his entire world rearranged itself around a truth he'd been too blind to see. The motorcycle engine outside cut off suddenly, followed by footsteps on gravel. Confident, purposeful steps that could only belong to Dylan Cross, but for the first time in days, Frank wasn't thinking about the young actor's threats. He was thinking about Steve's suicide attempt that had failed, about 40 years of carrying the wrong guilt, about a legacy built on lies he'd been too loyal to question. The knock on his door came sharp and insistent, but Frank didn't move. He was remembering November 7th with perfect, devastating clarity now. Not just his broken wrist, but Steve's relief when Frank couldn't drive. The way Steve had insisted on taking the Porsche instead of calling a cab. The strange finality in his voice when he'd said goodbye. "Open up, Morrison." Dylan's voice carried its usual arrogance, but something else now. Excitement. "I know Neil's in there. Her car's outside." Neil moved toward the door, but Frank caught her arm. "Wait." His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, hollowed out by revelation. "Let me handle this." He stood slowly, Steve's letter clutched in his trembling hand, and opened the door to find Dylan Cross grinning like a predator who'd cornered wounded prey. The young actor wore expensive jeans and a vintage motorcycle jacket that was probably worth more than Frank's trailer, his perfect teeth gleaming in the porch light. "Well, well, the band's all here." Dylan pushed past Frank without invitation, his eyes immediately finding Neil. "Mrs. McQueen, thanks for not returning my calls." Really added to the mystery. "It's MS Adams," Neil corrected icily. "And I told you everything you needed to know 3 days ago." Dylan's grin widened as he noticed the open envelope on the table, the medical center letterhead visible. "Oh, this is perfect. More evidence? You're making this too easy." He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo before Frank could stop him. Hospital records, witness testimony, and now what looks like a deathbed confession. My editor's going to cream himself. Frank felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of understanding that changed the entire landscape of his world. Dylan thought he'd discovered a story about a coward hiding behind a stunt double's courage. He had no idea he'd actually uncovered a tragedy about friendship, loyalty, and the crushing weight of public expectations. "You don't know what you're talking about," Frank said quietly. "Don't I?" Dylan's arrogance was intoxicating, his confidence absolute. I've got footage of you doing McQueen's stunts. I've got audio of him admitting he was afraid. I've got witnesses who remember the truth." He gestured toward the letter. "And now I've got whatever final confession that is. Face it, Morrison, your boyfriend wasn't the king of cool. He was just another actor who needed a body double to do the real work." The words hit Frank like a slap, but not because they hurt, because they revealed how completely Dylan misunderstood everything. The young actor saw only surface, only the celebrity mythology he was so eager to destroy. He couldn't comprehend the deeper truth about fear and friendship and the prices men pay for living other people's dreams. "Steve wasn't a coward," Frank said, his voice gaining strength. "And he wasn't my boyfriend, you little shit. He was a man trapped by an image he never asked for, doing work that terrified him because he thought that's what the world needed from him." Dylan laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, this is rich. You're still protecting him, even now?" He held up his phone, finger hovering over the screen. "I've already written the story, Morrison. Hollywood's greatest lie, how Steve McQueen's stunt double did all the real work while America's rebel hid behind fear. It goes live in 12 hours whether you cooperate or not." Frank looked at the young man's perfect face, at the hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with fame. Dylan Cross thought he was exposing a fraud, but he was actually about to crucify a man who died trying to live up to impossible expectations. A man who'd spent his final months wanting to give credit where it was due, but trapped by the very mythology Dylan was so eager to destroy. "You're right about one thing," Frank said finally. "Steve was afraid. But you're wrong about everything else." Dylan's grin faltered slightly, sensing something in Frank's tone he hadn't expected. "You think you've discovered some scandal about a coward hiding behind his stunt double," Frank continued, holding up Steve's letter. "But what you've actually found is a love story, not romantic love. Something deeper. The love between two men who understood that sometimes the real courage isn't in taking risks, but in letting someone else take them for you." And in that moment, Frank Morrison realized that Dylan Cross wasn't his enemy. The young actor was just another prisoner of the same mythology that had killed Steve McQueen. The toxic belief that being human was somehow the same as being weak. Dylan's expression shifted, confusion flickering across his perfect features like a crack in marble. He'd expected denial, anger, maybe desperate pleading, but not this quiet certainty that seemed to drain the power from his threats. "What the hell are you talking about?" Dylan demanded, but his voice had lost its cutting edge. The phone in his hand trembled slightly as Frank stepped closer, Steve's letter still clutched in his weathered fingers. "I'm talking about a 28-year-old kid from Missouri who never wanted to be a symbol," Frank said, his voice carrying 40 years of suppressed truth. "A guy who loved motorcycles but was terrified of the speeds Hollywood demanded. Who could handle a gun in real life but froze up when cameras rolled and directors screamed, 'Action!' Nail watched from the corner, her eyes bright with tears that had been building for decades. This was the conversation she'd been waiting for. Not just Frank finally speaking the truth, but someone finally understanding what Steve had really been asking for in that hospital room. Dylan backed toward the door, his journalist's instincts warring with something else. A growing realization that his exposé might be destroying something more fragile and precious than he'd anticipated. "You're trying to manipulate me. This is just damage control." "Kid, if I wanted to control damage, I'd have made that phone call you're so worried about." Frank gestured toward his ancient landline. "One word from me to the right people in this town, and you'd never work on anything bigger than a toothpaste commercial. But that's not what this is about anymore." Frank moved to the window, looking out at Dylan's gleaming motorcycle, a modern machine that probably cost more than Frank had made in his last 5 years combined. The sight triggered a memory so vivid it stole his breath. Steve, 19 years old, standing beside his first triumph in 1949, grinning like he'd conquered the world. Before the fame, before the fear, before the weight of other people's expectations turned joy into obligation. "You want to know what really happened the night Steve died?" Frank asked, not turning around. "He tried to kill himself 2 days earlier. Drove his Porsche into a guardrail on Mulholland because he couldn't stand being Steve McQueen anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Dylan's phone slipped in his grip, nearly falling to the trailer's stained carpet. This wasn't the story he'd prepared for, wasn't the neat narrative of cowardice and deception he'd crafted in his mind. Dylan's voice cracked. That's not possible. The accident report said whatever the studio needed it to say, Neil interjected, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Just like everything else in Steve's life, even his suicide attempt got rewritten as a minor traffic incident. Frank finally turned from the window, and Dylan saw something in the older man's eyes that made his stomach clench with unexpected shame. It wasn't defeat or resignation, it was pity. "You think you're brave, coming here with your threats and your exposé," Frank said. "But you're just another vulture feeding on a dead man's pain." Steve spent his whole career being devoured by people who thought they knew him better than he knew himself. And here you are, 43 years later, doing the exact same thing. Dylan's carefully constructed confidence was crumbling, replaced by something he hadn't felt since childhood, the sick realization that he might be fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. But the stunts, the footage, you did all the dangerous work while he took the credit. "I did the work he couldn't do," Frank corrected, "just like he did the work I couldn't do, dealing with fame, with pressure, with the weight of being everyone's fantasy of what a man should be. You think hiding behind a stunt double made him weak? Try standing in front of a camera knowing that millions of people are watching you pretend to be something you're not." The letter in Frank's hand rustled as his grip tightened. Dylan's eyes fixed on it, and Frank could see the young man's journalistic hunger warring with something else, a dawning understanding that some secrets weren't kept to protect lies, but to preserve something more valuable than truth. "That letter isn't a confession of cowardice," Frank continued. "It's Steve finally admitting what he'd been trying to tell the world for years, that the real hero of every Steve McQueen movie was the guy nobody knew existed. He died wanting to give me credit, but I was too proud and too scared to let him." Dylan's phone buzzed with a notification, probably his editor demanding an update on the story that was supposed to break tomorrow. But for the first time since he'd discovered the footage that started this whole mess, Dylan Cross found himself wondering if some stories were too important to tell, and if destroying a legend might also destroy the very real love that had created it. The point of no return wasn't just approaching, it had arrived, and everything would depend on what Dylan chose to do with the truth he'd fought so hard to uncover. Dylan stared at his phone as it buzzed insistently, his editor's name flashing on the screen like a digital countdown to destruction. The notification showed 17 missed calls, 12 text messages, all variations of the same demand. "Where's the fucking story?" "Answer it," Frank said quietly. Dylan's thumb hovered over the screen, paralyzed. Everything he'd built his career on, the hunger for the next big break, the willingness to destroy legends for clicks, the absolute certainty that exposure was always better than protection, crumbled as he looked into Frank Morrison's weathered face. This wasn't the broken old man he'd expected to intimidate. This was someone who'd spent 40 years carrying a weight that wasn't his to bear. "I can't," Dylan whispered, the words barely audible. "Why not?" Frank stepped closer, Steve's letter still in his hand. "Isn't this what you wanted, the scoop that makes your career?" Dylan's perfect composure finally shattered. His hands shook as he looked at the phone, at Niall's tear-streaked face, at the faded movie posters surrounding them like ghosts of a simpler time. "Because I don't understand what the story is anymore." Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of knots that had been tightening for decades. He'd spent so many years preparing for this moment, the inevitable exposure, the destruction of everything he'd protected, that he'd never considered the possibility of something else entirely, understanding, maybe even redemption. "The story isn't about cowardice," Frank said, his voice gentler now. "It's about what friendship looks like when the whole world is watching." Steve knew he was dying, knew his body was failing, knew he couldn't be the man everyone needed him to be anymore. But he also knew that if people found out their hero was human, it would break something in them they might never get back. Dylan's phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't even look at it. "So we made a choice," Frank continued. "I took the risks. He took the blame when things went wrong. I stayed invisible, he stayed invincible. It wasn't about fear, it was about love. The kind of love that says, I'll carry this weight so you don't have to." The trailer fell silent except for the distant sound of waves against Malibu rocks. Dylan stood frozen between two worlds, the one where Steve McQueen was a fraud and Dylan Cross was the journalist who exposed him, and another where legends were built on sacrifice and some truths were too sacred to destroy. "He wanted to tell people," Dylan said finally, his voice hollow. "About you, about what you really did. Read it yourself." Frank held out the letter, his hands steady for the first time in days. Dylan took the pages with trembling fingers, scanning Steve's words about deliberately crashing the Porsche, about wanting the world to know Frank Morrison's real contribution, about dying with the weight of public mythology crushing the life out of private truth. Each sentence was a nail in the coffin of the story Dylan had planned to tell. "Jesus," Dylan breathed. "He was going to give you credit, publicly. But I wouldn't let him," Frank said. "I was too proud, too scared of what would happen to his legacy. I thought protecting the myth was more important than honoring the man." Dylan's phone clattered to the floor as his legs gave out, landing hard on Frank's threadbare couch. The golden boy posture was gone, replaced by something raw and broken. "I've been such an asshole." "You've been young," Neil said softly, speaking for the first time in minutes. "There's a difference, though not much of one." Frank sat down across from Dylan, feeling ancient and exhausted but somehow cleaner than he'd felt in years. "You want to know what real courage looks like? It's Steve getting back on that motorcycle after every crash, knowing he might die, but also knowing that millions of kids were watching him and believing they could be brave too. It's him standing in front of cameras when he was so sick he could barely hold down water, because he understood that sometimes being a symbol matters more than being honest." Dylan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so unconsciously vulnerable that it reminded Frank of Steve at 20, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations he'd never asked for. "What do I do now?" Dylan asked. "My editor's expecting the story. My career depends on this." Frank looked at the young man who'd arrived as his destroyer and somehow became something else entirely, maybe even his salvation. The old Frank would have given him an ultimatum, demanded silence, protected the secret at any cost. But 40 years of carrying Steve's true final message had taught him something about the difference between secrets worth keeping and truths worth telling. "That depends," Frank said, "on what kind of man you want to be when this is over." Outside, the Pacific crashed against the shore with ancient rhythm, indifferent to human struggles with truth and consequence, while inside a weathered trailer, 3 people sat with the power to rewrite history, or finally allow it to rest in peace. 3 weeks later, Frank Morrison sat on his trailer's sagging porch at dawn, watching the Pacific paint itself gold in the early light. The same view that had haunted him for decades now offered something he'd forgotten existed: peace. Not the absence of pain, but its transformation into something bearable, even meaningful. Dylan's article had run exactly as promised, but not the one anyone expected. The last stunt, a love letter to Hollywood's invisible heroes, told the story of every nameless double, every uncredited performer who'd risked their lives so audiences could believe in magic. Steve McQueen appeared in it as Frank had always seen him, not as a fraud, but as a man brave enough to let others share his glory, even when the world demanded he claim it all himself. The piece had made Dylan's career, but more importantly, it had made him someone Frank could respect. The young actor still called weekly, not for interviews but for stories, tales of old Hollywood, of friendships forged in fire and chrome, of the price of living other people's dreams. Dylan was different now, humbled by the weight of truths he'd almost destroyed. Frank supposed that's what wisdom looked like at 28, the sudden understanding that some things were more important than being right. The letter from Steve sat framed on Frank's kitchen table now, no longer a burden but a benediction. Reading it each morning had become ritual, a way of honoring not just his friend's memory but the choice they'd made together. The world still saw Steve McQueen as the king of cool, but now Frank could carry that knowledge without guilt. The myth wasn't a lie, it was a collaboration. Neil had visited twice since that night, bringing coffee and conversation that slowly rebuilt bridges burned by decades of shared grief. They talked about Steve as he'd been, not as the world remembered him, scared sometimes, human always, but genuinely brave in ways that mattered more than motorcycle jumps or movie heroics. The courage to love completely, to trust absolutely, to die knowing he'd tried to honor the people who'd made his legend possible. Frank's phone rang, the old landline he'd kept despite Dylan's repeated offers to buy him a modern cell. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Mr. Morrison, this is James Can. Jimmy, Steve talked about you." Frank's hand tightened on the receiver, another ghost from Steve's world, reaching across time. "I read the article," Jimmy continued, "about what you guys did together. I just wanted to say, we all knew, you know? Not the details, but we knew Steve wasn't doing those stunts alone. We just didn't know how to thank the guy who was." The conversation lasted 20 minutes, stories and condolences intertwining like old friends. When it ended, Frank sat in the silence that followed, understanding finally that he'd never been as invisible as he'd believed. Steve's world had known, had appreciated, had simply been waiting for permission to acknowledge what they'd always seen. The mailbox yielded its daily treasure, letters from stunt performers around the world, sharing their own stories of anonymous courage and borrowed glory. Dylan's article had opened floodgates Frank never knew existed, revealing a community of shadows who'd finally found voice. Each letter was a small absolution, proof that his choice to protect Steve's legend had preserved something larger than one man's reputation. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Frank walked to the garage where Steve's old Triumph waited under a dusty tarp. He'd kept it running all these years, though he couldn't say why. Now he knew. Some things weren't meant to be museums. They were meant to be lived. The engine turned over on the third try, settling into the familiar rumble that had soundtracked their friendship. Frank had ridden behind Steve on this very bike 45 years ago, two kids drunk on speed and possibility, before fame complicated everything simple about their lives. Now he rode alone, but not lonely. Steve's presence filled the empty seat, not as ghost but as gift. The coastal highway stretched ahead, the same ribbon of asphalt where they'd tested limits and chased horizons. Frank opened the throttle and felt 40 years of weight lift from his shoulders, not disappearing but transforming into something he could carry proudly. The wind whipped tears from his eyes, and for the first time since Steve's death, Frank Morrison smiled without reservation. Behind him, the trailer grew small in his mirrors, no longer a prison but a way station. Ahead lay road he'd forgotten how to travel, not toward any destination but simply forward. The bike sang beneath him, Steve's laughter echoing in the engine's roar, and Frank understood finally what his friend's last words had really meant. Not a confession of cowardice, but a celebration of partnership. Not an ending, but a beginning. The king of cool and his shadow, riding into history together, exactly as they'd always been meant to be remembered. The Pacific stretched endlessly beside them, indifferent and eternal, while two old friends found their way home.